Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zahran. Thank you as always for tuning in to another edition of the show. Today, I want to talk about an uncomfortable topic and something that I've seen on my own personal work, but also that I've seen in the wider sports landscape as a whole. And shocking, I know as it might sound, that topic is racism. And, it's a word that a lot of people cringe at and avoid talking about because of the history behind it, right? You go all the way back to colonialism and like various racial superiority movements and that sort of thing. And, you kind of think you want to think that it's in the past, right? You want to think that, like here in the States, you want to think that, yeah, the civil rights movement happened in the 60s. That was multiple generations ago at this point, right? The thing is, it's not multiple generations ago. It's still happening today. And sports often is supposed to be a sort of escape, right? That we get away from our problems in real life and we consume this thing that brings us joy. And the whole ideal of sports is that you can be in the crowd next to someone of a different background, different ethnicity, different wealth class, and you two people are there with a singular goal in mind to watch your team win. And that's supposed to be the togetherness and the beauty of sport that makes so many of us fall in love with it, right? The problem is that we live in a world that is incapable of separating those two things. So I say all that to say that there's been a couple things that's been happening that have really charged up the red flags in me about where we are at racially in the world. So first, I'll start with the personal aspect. So you may remember a couple weeks ago now that there was a big incident about between Alyssa Thomas and Caitlin Clark in the WNBA. Thomas lands on Clark's throat with her arm. Some people think it's intentional, some people don't. Wasn't really called as anything in game. They reviewed it after the fact, and it was proactively upgraded to a flagrant 2. Thomas is suspended. And, that should be enough, right? Player did something dangerous. Other player, presumably seems okay in the grand scheme of things. And that player gets suspended for a game for a hostile act, right? That should be it on the basketball court. But like everything with Caitlin Clark, it became more than that, right? It became, that the whole jealousy and they hate Caitlin Clark thing and the league needs to protect her. She's the one that brings in the ratings, all the typical talking points. And on the flip side of that, everybody was like, well, now we're just kind of demonizing this black woman because that's what America does. And that had escalated. And Thomas was doing a press conference and was saying how she had received death threats and addresses were leaked that has gone beyond basketball, right? Stuff that you don't want to hear an athlete say. So I wrote a piece about it and I kind of compared it to the overall treatment of black women in American society, where this is a group of people that have been marginalized in recent years by the Trump administration. The DEI cutbacks adversely affected them the most. They lost so many jobs as a result of DEI cutbacks in the second Trump administration. And continuously, they have been, there's like misogynoir, there's all these different things that black women have to deal with. And I said, the way that Thomas was treated and talked about is reflective of that reality, right? That was the whole point of the piece. And I'll link the piece in the show notes so you can check it out. But so when I post my articles, right? Listen, I do this as a hobby. I podcast as a hobby. I don't try to make money off of this, right? And I just post it to social media, hope that somebody sees it, makes them think a little bit, and then they move on with their day. I'm not expecting anything to go viral. And I always post on 3 places. I post on Threads, I post on Blue Sky, and I post on Facebook. Facebook is really only there as a mechanism for friends and family if they want to read it, right? I don't anticipate any reactions, and typically that's what I get. I get very few views, very few reactions outside of a couple people. This one was not the case. As of this recording, it's over 350 comments right now. And almost all of them are disgusting, race-filled, hatred-filled bigotry, right? There was one guy who posted an AI-generated image likening the Thomas and Clark thing to George Floyd, I Can't Breathe. There was another that that was an AI-generated image of a black woman with the face of an ape. There have been multiple comments about black people being thugs. There are multiple comments about people just want to hate white women. So, like, I was being made out to be this sort of anti-white person, which is kind of crazy, right? And, that was the tone of the commentary, right? Real nasty, real racist. And there's, like I said, over 300 comments, by far my most engaged post ever on Facebook. Then I want to shift to the World Cup because that has also had some things happen. So, off the rip, there have been some suspect racial things going on with one of the host nations, the U.S., in the World Cup. There's the treatment of the Iranian team. There is the way that Somali referee was banned from entering to officiate in the World Cup. There's the way that Iraqi players were profiled before matches. The Senegalese team was harassed. There was a lot of stuff that happened there. There was also Argentinian fans who, in that country, has a notorious reputation for racism, that harassed the YouTuber I Show Speed by harassing him, telling him to go back to a zoo, and so all that has been happening. Then I want to specifically focus on the Paraguay-France game. And, so very physical game. Paraguay had kind of decided we're going to muck this thing up, try to take it to penalties and win that way. Unfortunately, they mucked it a little bit too far in one way, gave up a penalty, France wins 1-0. So there was like this whole thing between it, and like the French team, because of the way Paraguay was playing, didn't shake hands or whatever. It was like, there's like a little bit of a confrontation on the field, whatever. But then there was a comment by Celeste Amarilla. Who is Celeste Amarilla, you may ask? Well, she is a Paraguayan senator, and so she made some posts after the fact and called Kylian Mbappe, who, by the way, one of the best soccer players in the world. He is right behind Messi in most goals scored all time in the World Cup and will likely surpass Messi by the time his career is over. She called him a, quote, colonized Cameroonian, desperately trying to pass himself off as French. She also said that he was, quote, a brute who had not learned to write, close quote. Also invoked some drinking from coconuts trope as well. So super, super racist, right? And Mbappe later on said, through your recklessness and brazen racism, the entire world has already forgotten the journey and the historic effort that your players accomplished during this World Cup, making way for an incompetent woman who gives the worst possible image of her country. I will never allow people like her the freedom to spread their hatred and racism across the world. So Mbappe comes off looking pretty good here, right? Saying like, he kind of stands up against that racism, didn't tolerate it, all that. And Amarillo had kind of released a long, long press release after, blaming, categorizing his comments as sexism or whatever, and, didn't land. At the end of the day, she just still looks like a racist. And these things got me to thinking, why is it that this sort of rhetoric, this sort of commentary has become so common in the way that sports is consumed today? And I think it's multi-layered. And another example was I've seen posts on Threads and X and other platforms that, have people bemoaning this sort of the presence of black players on their teams. Like you think about France has multiple black players that are who born in France, but originally ancestrally are from West African nations. Belgium, same situation. England, same situation. The U.S. has foreign-born nationals as well. So this isn't a unique thing to one country. A lot of this has happened. You've seen fans saying, oh, I hate how this looks because eventually it's just going to be my country's Africans versus your country's Africans. And, distilling it down into so simple of a dichotomy is, well, patently ignorant, right? But it also speaks to this rising feeling of nationalism that we have throughout the world. And speaking specifically for the country that I live in the US, this has kind of really started when Trump first came into power, because there was a time when you would say stuff politically and but there was a line you didn't cross, right? You didn't go that far. You didn't be blatantly defamatory of other races of people. Trump comes in and he rewrites the rules of politics as a result, right? There is no code of ethics anymore. There is no decorum to the office of president, because he's just going on and talking about immigrants as invaders, talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of the country. Really xenophobic and white nationalist coded ideologies, right? And whenever there's instances of white supremacy, like the Unite the Right rally, January 6th, any sort of white nationalist, Western Front, whatever, patriot type protests or movements, he never really criticizes that, but he will jump and criticize Black Lives Matter, right? He will jump and generalize on cities that are predominantly black, like Detroit, Baltimore, and Chicago, right? So he targets Muslim countries. He has rolled back DEI, a lot of this stuff that's very white nationalistic facing, right? So when you have somebody who's captivated the attention of, give or take, 40 to 50% of a country, a huge country at that, that's going to change the way things are shaped. And then you see the way that we communicate these days is through social media, typically, right? And so the crazy thing that somebody would have said at a bar 15 years ago that you would have said, yeah, shut up, that's stupid, is now that person now has community. That person now has like-minded individuals. So I always say that Trump and other nationalist figures in Europe like him, a lot of people look at them as poison. I look at them as a mirror. And here is this person who says, here, look at what you actually are, and that's okay. And those people are then emboldened by their views, by their racism. And so we've seen it in the way Trump has acted in this World Cup, right? The way he treated the Iranian team, the Somali ref, the Senegalese players, it's just like all these things have happened and are indicative of a sort of white nationalist tint. I think it's probably pleases Trump greatly that in the final 8 of the World Cup, it's 6 European nations and a South American nation in Argentina that's often viewed as the whitest of those nations. And then you have lonely African Morocco, right? And I think he likes that idea, that it's mostly European countries, making it through. And what's happened now is that his talking points, his rhetoric, all that has seeped into multiple aspects. And we get back to the social media thing. Elon Musk's famously a huge proponent of Trump. So when the guy running the platform and becoming the most vocal user of that platform because he owns it and amplifies his own posts is parroting white nationalist agenda that aligns with the president of the United States, that app becomes breeding grounds for that. Then you go to the other apps, right? Blue Sky has become a little bit of a liberal echo chamber, but it doesn't have the pull. The problem with that platform is because it's become so much of an echo chamber, it's kind of almost become like a place where people just don't want to hang out online. And then you got like Threads and Instagram and stuff. Meta has rolled back a lot of its moderation in an effort to kind of appease these people. So what's happened is that hate speech and stuff like that is rampant online because these platforms don't really regulate it anymore. They've relied on the community notes model. So now people just say stuff. And there's an old Snow Goons song called SBS, which stands for Suckers Behind Screens. The idea was like, it was kind of criticizing keyboard warriors, right? People act tough online, but when it comes down to it, aren't really doing anything. And we have a lot of that now. We have a lot of people who are going to hide behind the fake profile picture, and they're going to say hateful stuff, and they're going to be racist, and they're going to do all that. Some of these people are stupid enough to have their real names on there, and they get found out and exposed a lot of times. But more often than not, they just run in anonymity, and they are then able to say whatever they want without any real sense of consequence, not really understanding if they have a sort of, you know, recourse for the way they feel, and not understanding that the trickle down effects of this. You think about the Louis Rossman doc about the manosphere. Just look at who they're targeting. Younger teenage boys, right? They're being taught to have this sort of toxic alpha male vibe, right? And that very quickly gets you down a path of misogyny, very quickly gets you down a path of racism. And I think I always laugh at the people that want to separate politics from sports, because politics has always been in sports. Race relations has always been in sports. In the 60s, Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, they were on the front llines of that stuff, right? In later years, we saw how Black Lives Matter impacted the NBA. We just remember Colin Kaepernick. You remember all this stuff. These have always been a part of it. The way Black players have been treated, the way Black players aren't really allowed to become Black coaches very often in a lot of these sports, right? The way that there aren't a lot of Black GMs. It's always been a part of it. But I think that there's been a comfort level with being a bigot, being a racist, like it's celebrated, right? There was a time when I was younger, I think, where if you started saying some super racist stuff, that you were kind of exiled, right? You were like, look at this degenerate with his stupid beliefs that nobody believes anymore, right? But then in 2016, it started to flip, right? And it's like, well, why shouldn't I be proud of my heritage? Was kind of the calling card of a lot of the white nationalist agenda. Why shouldn't I rail against immigration? It was cloaked in this whole taking our jobs thing. And in America, it's really, and other countries as well, but it's really kind of anti the whole idea, right? The whole idea is that it's a melting pot, right? I remember when I first moved to Detroit, and there was this segmentation in a way. It's like Detroit as a city is very Black, like 80+% Black. And white people started creeping up further and further north, right? Further and further north, getting away from the Black people. And that was so weird to me, because on my block in New York City, when I was growing up, we had Indian people, Arab people, Asian people, Black people, white people. We had everything, and they all kind of existed. Everybody had their own culture, and it was just kind of like there. And now it's just like we are so far removed from it, and the power of the internet has allowed us to give voices to people who are saying, "Yeah, I'm a hater. I'm a racist. I'm gonna be loud and proud of my beliefs, and there's nothing you can tell me about it." And then because algorithms are kind of designed to bring those people together, they find community in fellow racists, right? And then you end up with the type of rhetoric you have of people throwing throwing bananas at Black players, making monkey sounds, and rhetoric about the zoo. It's just kind of like it's an indication of how fractured we have become as a society, and it's an indication of how far we have to overcome the racism. And I'm going to quote somebody who I follow on Threads who has her own podcast, Tanya Ray Fox, and she has kind of been out in front about a lot of this stuff, and has said that it's not enough to just not be racist yourself. You have to advocate for being actively anti-racist. And I agree with that, because if you're just going to be like, well, I'm not racist and I'm not going to indulge in these comments, okay, sure. But you're not taking the people who are going to be racist to task. And I think that's a big gap, where you want to be the person who makes them feel stupid for feeling this way, right? Like, wow, you're an idiot. I can't believe you actually feel this way. Learn some culture, that sort of thing. Like being abrasive almost to that, because if you're not abrasive, ultimately, these people are never going to learn. We see it in every single sport. The way that certain people, like in the NBA, we've seen it in Utah with Russell Westbrook, We've seen a variety of players say that different crowds are, you know, they overstep the line in that regard. And this is what happens when the white superiority, white nationalist agenda is a mainstream political platform. It used to be a fringe. Now it's a mainstream platform. And that is incredibly problematic. I can't give you a solution other than we need to continue to shame these people for feeling the way that they feel. Because at the end of the day, I've always believed that racism is taught, not inherited, right? And you watch kids, right? If you were to place kids together from multiple different ethnic backgrounds in a sandbox and they have toys, they're going to share the toys, they're going to play with each other. It's only until their parents start instilling these different thoughts into them that they start going the other way. I think about when I coached soccer, right? It was my partner's youngest son. He's white kid, right? And that team had people from a bunch of different nationalities. You have multiple people from like Latin nationalities, a couple white kids, they all got along just fine, and that again is indicative to me of like we're born tolerant. It's just that we allow the noise from the outside eventually teach us another way. And it probably goes back to colonialism and the way that all that was taught. But we're at a tipping point here, I think, where you need to accept that your country's players, their best players, are not all going to look like you. Okay. And you need to accept, like, that's okay. That should be celebrated. Diversity is a good thing. You get multiple ideas, multiple viewpoints, and ultimately you have a better society. And, if people aren't willing to accept that, we need to be hostile. We need to be abrasive. We need to be like, that's not okay. And hopefully the world starts catching on to that. Otherwise, we're going to continue down this path, and this sort of stuff is going to continue to happen. All right, that's going to wrap it up for another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Before I sign off, though, I do want to talk about a little pivot I've made on the writing side of things. So you guys all know I've been writing on Medium for a long time. And lately, I've been feeling that a pivot was needed. So I have made my primary publishing on Ghost, which is a newsletter platform similar to a Substack, but, not platforming Nazis, which is, important to me. So if you go to deepcoversports.com, you can subscribe to receive all the articles. Cool thing about it, though, is that there's also a tab on the website for the podcast. So you could also links out to Spotify. So the most recent episode is there. So you could check out the latest podcast episode right from the website. So I have the link in the description, but deepcoversports.com, subscribe is completely free. If you are following on Medium, you will still receive those articles just a couple days after. So the Ghost website gets priority, and then you get it on Medium after the fact. So just wanted to leave you with that note. If you like the podcast, please consider subscribing, following on wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, I'm your host, Omar Zahran, and this has been the Deep Cover Podcast.